September 16, 2024, Reston, Virginia. A quiet autumn morning. Officer Peter Liu climbs to the third floor of a residential complex. Routine wellness check. Sydney Wilson, a successful 33-year-old woman, opens the door. Minutes later, gunshots shatter the silence. Sydney's body lies in the hallway. Beside her, a bloodied kitchen knife. How did an ordinary check turn into a deadly tragedy? Today, we will uncover every detail of this case. From the therapist's alarming call to the fatal shot. This story will make you reconsider everything you knew about mental health crises and police work. Our story begins not with tragedy, but with light. Sydney Wilson was born in Pennsylvania into a loving family that always supported her aspirations and dreams. From an early age, Sydney demonstrated exceptional abilities. She was a smart, curious, driven child who seemed capable of achieving anything. Her path to success began with admission to the prestigious St. John's College in Washington. There, Sydney quickly established herself as a brilliant student and charismatic leader. She was an active participant in student life, always ready to help her peers or lead a new project. After graduating from college, Sydney decided to continue her education at Georgetown University, one of the most respected educational institutions in the USA. She chose to specialize in business and management, demonstrating a remarkable aptitude for leadership and strategic thinking. But Sydney was not just an excellent student. She was that rare person who not only achieves her own goals but inspires others. She often mentored younger students, especially girls who dreamed of careers in business. Sydney generously shared her experience and knowledge, always finding time to listen and support. After graduating from university, all doors were open to Sydney. She could have chosen any company, any industry. But she decided to dedicate herself to a field that was truly close to her heart, real estate. Sydney started working at JLL, one of the leading firms in commercial real estate. There, she quickly established herself as a rising star. Her professionalism, charisma, and ability to build relationships helped her achieve the position of leasing manager in record time. Sydney's colleagues remember her as a tireless workaholic who was always ready to go the extra mile for a client or team member. She had a rare gift, the ability to see potential in people and projects, even when others doubted them. But work was not Sydney's only passion. Despite her busy schedule, she always found time for her second love, basketball. Since her school days, Sydney had been the star of the local basketball team, and this love of sports stayed with her throughout her life. She often spent weekends coaching girls from local schools, sharing with them not only sports skills but also life wisdom. For many of these girls, Sydney became a role model, an example of what can be achieved through perseverance and self-belief. So, at first glance, Sydney Wilson's life seemed perfect. She was the embodiment of the American dream, a smart, beautiful, successful woman who seemed to have it all. A brilliant career, loyal friends, a loving family, community respect. But as we know from bitter experience, the outward shine often conceals an inner struggle. And Sydney, despite all her achievements and successes, was no exception. When news of Sydney Wilson's tragic death spread through Reston, many were shocked. How could such a successful, cheerful person be gone so suddenly and tragically? What could have driven her to attack a police officer? These questions haunted everyone who knew Sydney. But for those closer to her, there may have been some alarming signs indicating a hidden struggle. One such sign appeared shortly before the tragedy, when Sydney shared on social media that she had taken a mental health first aid course. "I'm proud of this," she wrote. "As a leader, mentor, friend, daughter, it's important to be able to help and recognize issues in oneself and others. I think this is the greatest expression of love." These words, in retrospect, take on a new, tragic meaning. Perhaps, by taking this course, Sydney was trying not only to learn how to help others but also to better understand herself, her own problems. Perhaps this was her way of asking for help without saying it directly. People who knew Sydney recall that in the months leading up to the tragedy, she seemed more withdrawn, distant. She increasingly declined social interactions, citing fatigue or being busy at work. But perhaps behind these excuses hid something more, a growing sense of anxiety, depression, maybe even despair. Of course, all this is just speculation. Without access to Sydney's medical history, we cannot know for certain what psychological challenges she may have been facing. But we do know that mental illnesses often go unnoticed and untreated, especially among seemingly successful people. Statistics show that about 20% of American adults face mental health issues each year. However, only half of them receive necessary treatment. This means that millions of people, like Sydney, may be suffering silently without getting the help they need. The stigma around mental health often forces people to suffer in silence, fearing judgment or career consequences. This is especially true for women and minorities, who already face additional barriers and biases in the professional world. Perhaps Sydney felt she could not openly talk about her issues without risking her image as a successful, put-together professional. Maybe she thought she had to handle it on her own, as she did with all other challenges in her life. But mental health is not something one can handle alone. It is not a sign of weakness or inability. It is a medical condition that requires professional help and support, like any other illness. Unfortunately, our society does not always understand this. We live in a culture that values strength, resilience, the ability to take a hit. We often ignore or downplay mental health issues, seeing them as something that can be overcome by willpower or positive thinking. But the reality is that none of us are immune to psychological challenges. Life circumstances, genetics, trauma, all these can impact our mental well-being. And when we face such challenges, we need compassion, understanding, and professional help, not judgment or dismissal. Sydney Wilson's story is a painful reminder of what can happen when mental health issues go unnoticed and untreated. It is a call to all of us to be more attentive to ourselves and our loved ones, to not be ashamed to seek help when we need it. Because otherwise, as we see in Sydney's case, the consequences can be tragic. September 16, 2024 started as an ordinary day. Nothing foretold the tragedy. Reston awoke under a gentle autumn sun, ready for a new day filled with usual errands and joys. For Officer Peter Liu, this was also supposed to be a normal workday. He woke up early as always, put on his uniform, and headed to the station. There, he received his first assignment, to conduct a wellness check at an address he did not yet know would become the site of a tragedy that would forever change his life. A wellness check is a routine procedure for police officers. Usually, they receive such requests from concerned relatives, friends, or neighbors who cannot get in touch with someone and are worried about their safety. Usually, everything ends well, the person just didn't hear the phone or was busy. But this time, things were different. The request came from Sydney Wilson's therapist, who was alarmed by her agitated state during their last conversation. This was already a troubling sign. Therapists do not often turn to the police unless they have serious reasons for concern. Officer Liu arrived at the address, Sydney's apartment in the Reston Heights area, around 10:07 a.m. He climbed to the third floor, found the right door, and knocked, not yet knowing that behind it awaited the most terrifying challenge of his career. When the door opened, Sydney Wilson stood on the threshold, a tall, slim woman in a bathrobe. She didn't look agitated or angry. On the contrary, her face was calm, almost expressionless. She greeted him quietly, saying hello twice. But then something strange happened. As soon as Officer Liu introduced himself and explained the purpose of his visit, Sydney abruptly closed the door. This was the first sign that something was wrong. The next few minutes, recorded by the camera on Officer Liu's chest, seem almost surreal in their ordinariness. He continues to knock on the door, gently urging Sydney to open up, explaining that he's there to help, that her therapist is worried about her. His voice is calm, professional, but there are already notes of concern in it. In response, only silence, broken perhaps by the muffled sounds of music from behind the door. Perhaps this was Sydney's attempt to block out reality, to find solace in familiar melodies. Or perhaps it was a sign of growing despair, an attempt to escape from something that was haunting her mind. We can only guess what was going through Sydney's head in those minutes. Did she understand who was at the door? Did she hear Officer Liu's words, his offers of help? Or perhaps she was already too deep in the labyrinths of her mind, Too far from reality to comprehend what was happening? These questions will likely haunt everyone who knew Sydney for the rest of their days. They will replay these minutes in their heads over and over, searching for answers, for signs, for something that could explain the subsequent events. But in that moment, for Officer Liu, this was just another call. He couldn't have known that behind the door awaited not just a person in distress, but a deadly threat. He couldn't have predicted that his attempts to help would lead to the most terrifying, most traumatic experience of his life. Everything changed at 10:17 when the door suddenly opened. What happened next will forever remain in the memory of Officer Liu and everyone who saw the recording from his camera. When the door opened the second time, Officer Liu was faced with a completely different Sydney Wilson. Her eyes burned with some wild, inhuman fire. Her face was twisted into a grimace of rage and despair. And in her hand was a large kitchen knife, ominous, gleaming, deadly dangerous. What happened next unfolded so quickly that the mind could barely comprehend it. Sydney lunged at Officer Liu with incredible speed and force. Her movements were chaotic, uncontrolled, but filled with determination. "Oh God," was all Officer Liu managed to exclaim before the fight for life began. He tried to back away, to create distance between himself and Sydney, while at the same time begging her to stop, to drop the knife. But she seemed not to hear, not to see anything around her except her goal. The next seconds turned into a whirlwind of adrenaline and fear. Officer Liu continued to retreat down the narrow hallway, his voice becoming more desperate, his pleas louder. But Sydney didn't stop. She continued to attack with furious rage, her knife slicing through the air again and again. And then the inevitable happened. At some point, Sydney did reach Officer Liu. The knife found its target, slicing through flesh, tearing through the uniform. Pain and shock reflected on the officer's face, but he couldn't afford to stop. He continued to back away, now leaving a trail of blood behind him. For Officer Liu, it was now a matter of life and death. He was trapped, at the end of the hallway, wounded, face to face with a woman who seemed to have lost any connection to reality. At this moment, driven by the instinct of self-preservation and years of training, he made the hardest decision of his life. "Stop or I'll shoot." His voice echoed in the hallway, filled with desperation and pleading. But Sydney didn't respond. She took another step forward, her knife ready for the fatal blow. And at that moment, a shot rang out. Then another. And another. The sound of gunshots shattered the morning silence, echoing through the building's corridors. For some, it was just a sound, distant and incomprehensible. But for Officer Liu and Sydney Wilson, it was the sound that forever changed their lives. Sydney's body jerked with each shot, but she kept moving forward, as if not feeling the pain, not understanding what had happened. She took a few more steps before finally falling, her knife clattering to the floor. And there she lies motionless, her eyes still open but seeing nothing. On her chest, bloodstains spread, each a testament to the tragedy that just occurred. Above her stands Officer Liu, his gun still smoking. His hands are shaking, his breathing heavy and uneven. On his face is an expression of shock, horror, and pain that cannot be described in words. For him, as for all of us, this moment will be an eternal reminder of the fragility of life, of how quickly everything can change, of how even the best intentions can lead to tragedy. The officer's actions raise questions. First of all, it should be noted that the police officer made a serious mistake by allowing the woman in a state of affect to significantly reduce the distance. Despite the fact that Sydney Wilson was a sturdily built and tall woman who could potentially pose a physical threat, the police officer was obliged to follow the protocol and take all necessary measures to de-escalate the situation. Perhaps the police officer was indeed frightened and found himself in a state of affect when faced with the aggressive behavior of a woman armed with a knife. However, fear or a state of affect cannot justify his further actions and violation of the protocol. According to the rules, the police officer should have fired a warning shot in a safe direction, and in the worst case, fired a shot at the attacker's lower limbs to neutralize her and minimize the risk of a fatal outcome. However, this was not done. Although under U.S. law, a police officer has the right to use force for self-defense in the event of an attack, This does not mean that he can act uncontrollably and ignore the principles of humanity. The use of lethal force should be a last resort when all other options have been exhausted. The tragic death of Sidney Wilson raises concerns about the possible influence of race on the actions of the police officer. The question remains open as to whether he would have acted differently if a white woman with mental disorders had been in a similar condition instead of a dark-skinned woman. This case resembles the resonant case of George Floyd, when a police officer brutally and unreasonably strangled a dark-skinned offender on the asphalt, which led to his death and mass protests against racism and police brutality. Certainly, we strongly oppose any manifestations of racism, social inequality, and bias, including on the part of law enforcement agencies. The deaths of Sidney Wilson and George Floyd are alarming signals that point to systemic problems in the work of the police and the attitude towards people with different skin colors. These incidents cannot be viewed as isolated cases because they are part of a broader picture of racial discrimination and disproportionate use of force against dark-skinned citizens. Prejudice and stereotypes, which, unfortunately, are still present in society and among law enforcement officials, lead to tragic consequences and undermine trust in the justice system. To correct this situation, decisive and comprehensive measures are needed. The tragic events of that fatal morning left many questions unanswered. Why did Sidney Wilson, who seemed the embodiment of success, suddenly turn into a dangerous and unpredictable person? To understand this, we need to look deeper into the complex nature of the human psyche and the circumstances that could have led to this tragedy. First, it's worth noting that mental disorders are not always obvious to those around. The phenomenon known as high-functioning depression or high-functioning anxiety can be particularly insidious. People with these conditions can appear quite functional in everyday life, hiding their inner suffering behind a mask of competence. According to the National Institute of Mental Health, about 7% of American adults suffer from major depressive disorder and 19% from anxiety disorders. However, these figures may be underestimated, as many people do not seek help due to stigma or fear. In Sidney's case, her outward success could have served as a kind of defense mechanism, a way to escape from inner demons. Excessive busyness and constant striving for new achievements could have been an attempt to drown out inner pain or anxiety. Moreover, the high expectations Sidney may have set for herself could have created additional pressure. In our society, especially for women in the corporate world, there is constant pressure to be perfect. This pressure can be extremely draining, especially if one is already struggling with internal issues. Another important factor to consider is the possibility of a misdiagnosed or untreated mental disorder. Many serious mental illnesses, such as bipolar disorder or schizophrenia, can manifest in early adulthood. These diseases can be characterized by periods of relative stability followed by episodes of acute psychosis or mania. Statistics show that about 2.8% of American adults suffer from bipolar disorder and 0.3% from schizophrenia. However, diagnosing these diseases can be difficult, especially if the person does not seek professional help. If Sidney was suffering from such a disorder but not receiving proper treatment, it could have led to a gradual deterioration of her condition, culminating in a psychotic episode. During such an episode, a person can lose touch with reality, experience paranoia or hallucinations, and act unpredictably and aggressively. It's also important to consider the role of trauma in the development of mental health problems. Although we have no information about specific traumatic events in Sidney's life, we cannot rule out the possibility that she experienced some form of trauma, whether in childhood or adulthood. Trauma can have long-lasting effects on mental health, and its impact may manifest years after the event itself. Trauma can lead to the development of post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, which is characterized by recurring intrusive memories of the traumatic event, avoidance of triggers associated with the trauma, and heightened reactivity. In some cases, PTSD can lead to dissociative states, during which a person may act unpredictably and aggressively. According to the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, about 6% of the population suffers from PTSD at some point in their lives. This figure may be higher for certain groups, such as victims of violence or veterans. Another factor that could have influenced Sidney's mental state is social isolation. despite her professional successes, we don't know how deep and supportive her personal relationships were. A person can be surrounded by people and still feel lonely and isolated. Social isolation and feelings of alienation can significantly worsen mental health. They can exacerbate symptoms of depression and anxiety, lead to distorted perceptions of reality, and, in extreme cases, to paranoid thoughts. A study published in the American Journal of Psychiatry in 2020 showed that social isolation is associated with a 50% increased risk of depression and a 30% increased risk of anxiety. It's also important to consider the possible role of substance abuse. Although we have no specific evidence that Sydney had problems with drugs or alcohol, this is a factor that cannot be ignored. Substance abuse is often an attempt at self-medication for undiagnosed mental disorders. It can temporarily alleviate symptoms, but in the long run can significantly worsen mental health and lead to unpredictable behavior. According to the National Institute on Drug Abuse, about 50% of people with serious mental disorders also suffer from substance use disorders. This comorbidity can significantly complicate the diagnosis and treatment of the underlying mental disorder. Furthermore, one cannot underestimate the impact of social media and the constant flow of information on our mental health. In a world where we constantly compare ourselves to idealized versions of others' lives on social networks, it can be extremely difficult to maintain mental balance. This can lead to increased anxiety, feelings of inadequacy, and, in extreme cases, a disconnect from reality. A study published in the journals Cyberpsychology, Behavior, and Social Networking in 2023 found a link between intensive social media use and an increased risk of depression, especially among young adults. Finally, we must consider the possibility that Sydney may have been going through some personal crisis that we are unaware of. This could have been a breakup, financial problems, health issues, or any other situation that could have caused severe stress and despair. All these factors could have acted separately or, more likely, in combination, creating a perfect storm of conditions that led to the tragic events of that morning. It's important to understand that mental health is a complex and multifaceted topic. There are no simple explanations or easy solutions. Each person is unique, and the path to a mental health crisis is often the result of a complex interplay of biological, psychological, and social factors. Sydney Wilson's tragedy reminds us of the importance of mental health and the need to create a society where people can openly talk about their problems and receive the necessary help without fear of stigmatization. This story also highlights the need for better training of law enforcement and other first responders to deal with people in mental health crises. Perhaps if alternative response methods were available, such as crisis intervention teams involving mental health professionals, this tragedy could have been prevented. Ultimately, Sydney Wilson's story is not just about one tragic incident. It's a story about the complexity of the human psyche, about the invisible battles that many of us fight every day, and about the urgent need for greater understanding, compassion, and support for those struggling with mental health issues. The shots that rang out that morning in the hallways of the Reston Heights building reverberated for a long time. Not only in the minds of those directly involved in the tragedy, but in the hearts of the entire community. For Sydney Wilson's family and friends, this news was a crushing blow. They could not and did not want to believe that their beloved daughter, sister, friend was gone so suddenly and tragically. They could not comprehend what drove her to such a desperate act, what made her attack a police officer. Their pain and grief are impossible to convey in words. Each of them will carry this loss to the end of their days. Each will replay those fatal minutes in their heads, searching for answers they may never find. They will remember Sydney not as she was in those final minutes, filled with rage and despair. They will remember her smile, her kindness, her indomitable spirit. They will cherish every moment spent with her, every memory she left behind. But their grief will be overshadowed by questions, doubts, perhaps even anger. Why did this happen? Could it have been avoided? Did they do enough to help Sydney? These questions will haunt not only them but the entire Reston community. Because Sydney Wilson's tragedy is not just a personal loss. It's a painful reminder of how fragile our mental health is, how important it is to take care of each other. Officer Peter Liu will also carry the burden of this tragedy for the rest of his days. Although he acted by protocol, although he was undoubtedly saving his own life, the very fact that he was forced to take another life will forever change him. He will replay those minutes in his head over and over, wondering if he could have done something differently. If he could have somehow reached Sydney, prevented the tragedy. Rationally, he will understand that he probably couldn't. But emotionally, it will be a long and exhausting struggle. He will have to face not only his own demons but also the public's reaction. There will be those who call him a hero, who say he did the right thing. But there will also be those who condemn him, who question his actions. It's not an easy burden, being the one who survived, the one who was forced to make an impossible choice. And Officer Liu deserves our understanding and support, even as we mourn the loss of Sydney. For the Reston police, for the entire law enforcement system, this tragedy will be another painful reminder of the challenges they face every day, of the impossible decisions they have to make, of the burden of responsibility they carry. Statistics show that cases of fatal use of force by police remain a serious problem in the USA. According to the Washington Post, about 1,000 people are killed by police each year. Although most of these cases are deemed justified, each one is a tragedy and leaves a deep mark on the lives of all involved. This tragedy will also be a catalyst for reflection and discussion. Are we doing enough to support our police officers? Are we providing them with the necessary tools and training to deal with people in crisis situations? Is there a way to prevent similar tragedies in the future? These discussions will be complex, sometimes painful. But they are necessary if we want to move forward, if we want to build a safer and more compassionate society. Every tragedy, however painful, carries within it a seed of learning. It challenges our assumptions, our understanding of the world and of ourselves. It forces us to question the status quo and look for ways to change. Sydney Wilson's tragedy is no exception. It has highlighted numerous problems in our society, from the stigma around mental health to the role of police in responding to crisis situations. And if we want to honor Sydney's memory, if we want to prevent similar tragedies in the future, we must address these issues. Perhaps the most important lesson we can take from this tragedy is the importance of compassion and understanding. We all go through difficult times, we all have our own battles. And we never know what other people are going through. So instead of judging or turning away, we must learn to listen, support, and extend a helping hand. We must build communities where everyone feels valued and heard, where no one is left alone with their pain. This is not an easy path. It will require hard work, uncomfortable conversations, and painful changes. But if we want to create a society where tragedies like Sydney Wilson's story become less common, we must walk this path. Sydney Wilson lived a life full of light and promise. She touched countless lives with her kindness, generosity, and indomitable spirit. She was a beloved daughter, a devoted friend, an inspiring mentor, and a brilliant professional. Her tragic death has left an unhealing wound in the hearts of all who knew her. She left too soon, too suddenly, leaving behind countless questions and unfulfilled dreams. But her legacy lives on. It lives in the smiles of the girls she coached and inspired. It lives in the successes of her colleagues and clients whom she helped achieve their goals. It lives in the memories of her loved ones, who will always keep her in their hearts. And it lives in the lessons we can learn from her story. In our quest to create a world where every person feels supported and understood, where mental health is a priority, where tragedies like this become less common. This will not be an easy journey. It will be filled with challenges, obstacles, and setbacks. But we must walk it. For Sydney, for all those whose stories are similar to hers, for ourselves and our communities. So let's remember Sydney Wilson. Not only the tragedy of her death but the triumph of her life. Let's draw strength from her example, from her inextinguishable spirit and boundless compassion. And let's work together to create a world worthy of her memory. This story is not an easy one. It forces us to confront some of the darkest aspects of the human experience. But it also gives us hope, reminds us of the strength of the human spirit and the importance of supporting each other. Remember, each of us can contribute to creating a more compassionate and understanding society. Even the smallest actions can have a huge impact. Thank you again for joining me today. Don't forget to subscribe to the Detective Brooks Stories channel for more captivating and informative investigations. And in the comments, share your thoughts, stories, and ideas. How can we honor Sydney Wilson's memory and prevent similar tragedies in the future? This was Detective Brooks. Until next time.